guys have been loving these recent videos that go over how to buff certain groups of Pokemon. So recently I actually let you guys vote on the next group of Pokemon we're going to be covering, and with a 35% majority, you guys decided that we would be buffing the regional birds in VGC, and show just how good they could be with some very minor improvements. Now, just like with the other two videos we've done on this, we're going to keep up with that roughly 535 base stat total as a maximum amount, as just like with the Pika clones and the starters, these are still pretty early on encounters, and I don't want to just give 650 BST to a Pokemon just to make it viable. We are going to look into other options though as far as buffing these Pokemon go, such as making their typing different, giving them extra moves, or even changing around abilities, in order to make sure that all of these Pokemon have as much of a chance as possible at being competitively viable, while sticking as true as we can to the initial intention. Let me know down below what groups of Pokemon you guys want to see me cover next. And while you're on the way down there, make sure to consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. I make a lot of content that discusses how to buff certain Pokemon in VGC, as well as other more nuanced topics, such as how Pokemon could have done in previous generations, or old Pokemon that aren't in Scarlet and Violet would perform. So if you're curious about content like that, consider subscribing, because only about 4% of you guys watching this video are actually subscribed. With that out of the way though, let's head on over to Kanto to start off with Pidgeot. Now, Pidgeot is a pretty unfortunate bird when it comes to VGC, for quite a few reasons. Having a rather unimpressive stat line at base 479 and a fairly terrible typing, Pidgeot falls into a pretty terrible category of Pokemon that just have no use whatsoever in VGC. With very few options for strong stab, as well as a very terrible pool of abilities, it's no wonder to see why this Pokemon fails to perform in double. In order to improve Pidgeot, we're going to start off by using that 56 BST available to us to put strictly towards its offensive stat. For starters, let's give Pidgeot a boost of 20 to its speed, and we're going to give the remaining 36 to its special attack. This brings Pidgeot's offensive stats up to 106 for special attack and a daunting 121 speed, which is actually pretty good, as this outpaces a lot of common options like Roaring Moon and even Tornadus. While this isn't anything to write home about, we're not done just yet. Considering Pidgeot has a pretty horrible move pool, we do need to buff this significantly in order to give it any chance of success. So we're going to start off by adding Hyper Voice and Boom Burst as two really strong normal stab options that it can finally take advantage of. This way you have two different options for a strong normal stab, as Hyper Voice will only hit the enemy but it'll deal less damage, and Boom Burst, while it will target your ally, at the same time this can be played around with options like Protector or Ghost type, and you'll deal significantly more damage to the enemy. I do want to also really quickly give it back No Guard that the Mega option actually did have, since with options like Heat Wave and Hurricane, these will become fairly usable stabs. While I do think that stat-wise this is objectively just a worse version of Mega Pidgeot, at the same time though, with the ability to hold an item like a Life Orb or a Choice Specs, you can definitely make this into a fairly good option, especially with the very improved move pool that we've given it, as now we finally have a good normal stab. I think this at least makes Pidgeot meet the bare minimum requirements to be a usable flying type in VGC, but we're not done just yet, as we have plenty of other birds to go over today. Now, Noctowl is going to be a bit more difficult to fix. I think it just needs to lean into that fairly bulky, okay option and really dial it up to an 11 here. We're going to start off by removing 30 in its speed and moving this over to special attack, making it now have a base 40 speed and 116 special attack. Already, this is a really big improvement, as now Noctowl has a much better position to function as a bulky tank, and with options like Tinted Lens, you can decently take advantage of Trick Room here. Speaking of Trick Room though, we still have 53 more points, and we're going to put these into the defense, meanwhile another 30 base into the special defense, to make sure that its bulk goes up to 100 HP, 103 physical defense, and 126 special defense respectively. This will turn Noctowl into a rather good offensive tank that can provide some really good options for teams in Trick Room in order to both deal a lot of damage and be a nice spore immunity thanks to the ability Insomnia. This helps a lot in the matchup against mons like Amoonguss, which typically really do screw over Trick Room teams, so this actually would help Noctowl a lot here. Just in case if we can't run Tinted Lens though, I do want to also give Noctowl Focus Blast, as this would be meaningful coverage for options like Rock types and Steel types that you might otherwise not necessarily be able to fit without having 4 different very polarizing moves for neutral coverage. I think overall, Noctowl can definitely get a lot of capability out of this, and I don't really think it would be too overtuned because there's still a lot of slower Trick Room threats such as Torkoal that would still outpace and outdamage you, but it at least gives Noctowl a really distinct niche in VGC for sure. Now, Swellow is a pretty difficult Pokemon to buff, and that's not because there aren't ways to improve it, but it could get very overtuned really quickly here. With Swellow's pretty unimpressive stat line, I think we should just start by making this into a better offensive option, by giving it an extra 30 in both offensive stats. With Scrappy Boom Burst coming off of a base 105 special attack, or Guts, Facade, and Brave Bird coming off of base 115, this is already a very huge improvement, and I think it does a majority of the fixes we need on Swellow. The only other fix I could probably suggest here, without making it too overpowered, would be giving it the option of Feint, as this gives a lot more benefits than just Quick Attack, despite the fact that Quick Attack is slightly stronger, due to the fact that Feint would actually allow Swellow to break through Protect finally. I think for a final buff, we're going to give Swellow Superpower, as while Close Combat would technically be strictly better, I think at the same time, I want to avoid giving it too low drawback of a fighting option, and with Superpower at least dropping your attack by 1 stage every time you use it, while still giving you meaningful coverage for Steel and Rock type, types, I think this is a meaningful compromise here. I think this should be the perfect buff for a really good mixed attacking glass cannon option that would otherwise become very overpowered if we were to give it a move like close combat here. And I think this should help solo a lot in terms of keeping up relevancy in doubles. Despite the underperformance Staraptor has had in Scarlet and Violet, this is still a pretty difficult Pokemon to buff because it honestly is almost at the mark. With 485 BST and a really good ability and move pool to work off of, we don't really have a lot of options to actually buff Staraptor because we have a lot of normal and flying types, and we're going to go over a Pokemon up next that is essentially going to end up getting a Staraptor light set of buffs. I'm going to actually take the liberty of making Staraptor into a now fighting and flying typing. With access to stab close combat as well as stab Brave Bird, this turns into a very potent wall breaking option that with Terra fighting and an adamant choice scarf could actually guarantee an OHKO even after Intimidate on Standard Incineroar. Just for good measure too, we're going to buff the speed by 20 points, and while I do have another 30 VST that we could work with, I think the 120 speed here with options like Choice Scarf and Choice Band will be plenty to make Staraptor finally noteworthy again and competitive. And I'm really worried that if we give it those extra 30, even in just defenses, that this becomes a very broken Pokemon. Unfezant's gonna be where I'm sure a lot of you guys expected me to take Staraptor's buffs though. For starters, let's give this thing a stat buff all the way to that maximum of 47, and we're gonna give 37 of those points right into the speed stat. With an extra 10 into attack, this should bring Unfezant's offenses up to 125 attack and 130 speed, making it into a decent option, but not quite there yet. With this typing, Unfezant still is definitely not the best option, so we're gonna give it a very dangerous physical ability in the form of Tough Claws. I think this could be a pretty big deal, and it would assist in its otherwise decent physical move pool, benefiting moves like Brave Bird, Quick Attack, Knockoff, and U-Turn to name a few. While I do think that the move pool is already pretty good, we're gonna tack on Faint and Bulk Up to give it a nice option to break through Protect, as well as a good form of setup that isn't gonna be too overtuned like Swords Dance. And for good measure, we're going to add on close combat as well because it's meaningful coverage for a normal and flying type to have. Now I know this is a pretty cliche option, and I'm sure you've heard this from every YouTuber before discussing how to fix Talonflame, but I think in this particular instance, it actually has a very particular reason. With Tornadus and Whimsicott both getting some pretty big buffs in the form of Whimsicott having the automatic speed as well as options like Encore and Taunt to disrupt. Meanwhile, Tornadus now has Bleak Windstorm as a really strong flying spread stab. I think Talonflame really does need an option to actually keep up with these two as far as Tailwind support goes. Considering the fact that you would be trading an option like Priority Taunt, which is very useful on both Tornadus and Whimsicott, for a more consistent option in Priority Brave Bird and Hurricane, I think this would at least give some sort of option to use Talonflame finally in actual formats in VGC outside of the early years. I think this will be plenty, and I really don't think that anyone will have major complaints over Talonflame, since it's still gonna have a lot of the same issues such as being susceptible to priority, or even just still needing to run options like Covert Cloak to avoid fake out pressure early on, but at minimum, I think this finally has more of a reason to be used in formats like Regulation E and F again. Toucannon's probably gonna be the most difficult Pokemon to buff of all of the ones we're gonna be discussing today, because it honestly also has a lot going for it, but also very little at the same time. I think yet again, we're gonna look into changing the typing here, in favor of a Grass primary typing here. With Grass Stab for Bullet Seed as well as Flying Stab for Brave Bird, you can tack on coverage moves like Temper Flare for steals, and this is already a pretty big leg up on the competition. Next up, we're gonna change Beak Blast, and the only thing I want to change here is just making this into a flying type physical equivalent of Scald. With 80 base power and a 30% chance to burn and no real negative priority here, this would actually give Toucannon a nice strong option that doesn't need to just be recoil heavy. Not only this, but it would be a very viable stab to fit on the Sheer Force sets outside of just throwing a Gunk Shot. And I think that especially with loaded dice as an item, this could be a really good option for Toucannon to finally actually utilize Sheer Force to its fullest potential. Finally, let's give it some stat buffs, and I'm thinking here we'll give it 30 more speed as well as 20 more special attack in order to give some more relevancy to options like Hurricane, Heat Wave, and Boom Burst when we do use the Sheer Force sets on the special side of things. Speaking of these special sets though, because of the fact that we are now a primary grass type, I do want to give it an option that can at least take advantage of Sheer Force. So we're going to actually give it Energy Ball. While Giga Drain is a strictly better grass type stab in general, I think it wouldn't really have as much relevancy as a Sheer Force boosted Energy Ball here, and I don't really want to give a Pokemon that is as bulky as Toucannon good sustain, especially when we have already given it a lot to work with outside of just Giga Drain. I think Toucannon could make a really good dangerous mixed Scarf option with a rework like this, since there's plenty of coverage to benefit both physical and special now, and with a much more potent offensive stab, I think this could really do some work for it. Just like with Talonflame, Corviknight's also in a really weird position, where honestly, it's probably pretty fine to leave. Considering we're buffing a lot of the other birds though, I don't want Corviknight to just fall to the wayside because of this, so we're going to give it some very minimal buffs. I'm thinking increasing each of its defensive stats by 15, as well as a 10 base buff to its attack, and I think the rest of Corviknight can honestly just work as is. While Corviknight would probably be utilizing Iron Defense and Body Press sets the most, I still do want to buff both the special defense so it can have a little bit better sustain, as well as the attack so that way then options like Brave Bird and Iron Head can deal a little bit more damage for the bird. I think it's already a pretty good option for specific types of formats that are very physically heavy, as we have seen options like Iron Defense, Body Press, Corviknight terrorize Regulation E before, as well as Regulation C. I do think though at the same time having a little bit more versatility in the offensive stab you could be running here will be pretty good, as really in any format that a physical ground type with low coverage is viable, Corviknight would have at least some form of irrelevancy here. Finally, let's talk about Zapdos Jr. being Kilowatts. Now this is probably going to be a very obnoxious Pokemon to buff, as unlike with Toucannon where we're going to struggle on ways to improve it, we need to actually be very careful about not improving this thing too much, as we have 3 different electric and flying legendaries to compare Kilowattrel to, and we can't just make it better than these. I think the pretty easy place to start is by giving Kilowattrel a base 15 buff to its speed, allowing us to finally creep options like Flutterman and Chiampao to fire off some faster Electro Webs. From here, let's also give it a 10 base buff to both defenses as well as its special attack stat. This still keeps Kilowattrel on a rather frailer option as compared to Pokemon like Thundurus and Zapdos, while still having some decent merit because it would have a niche as the fastest electric flying in the format. At the same time though, if you want a more offensive option, you would need to go to an option like Zapdos or Thundurus, and with Thundurus Incarnate, you still do have faster support through Thunder Wave, but it's not going to be the catch-all option that Kilowattrel will be, as moves like Electro Web will still hit first, and you also get Tailwind, which is something that Thundurus would lack anyway. I think this essentially gives it a nice little Swiss Army knife approach to all 3 of the electric and flying type legendary Pokemon, without making it too much better than any one of these, and I think it could be a real niche that Kilowattrel could have, especially with its ability competitive being so good into Intimidate heavy formats. Let me know down below what you guys think of all of our early route Burt buffs, and also if you have any ideas of your own, I'd love to hear them as well. If you haven't already, make sure to leave a like in the video and subscribe for more, as we upload content every week. This is one of the first videos being handled by our new editor Dose, so if you haven't already, make sure to check them out down below, as they do an incredible job on editing these videos, and I would love it if you guys can give them some more support on their links to Twitter and their YouTube. Also, consider checking out my short form editor Becca, who handles a lot of the short form content on this channel. Most likely a lot of you guys who have found the content have found it through the short form, as that's when a lot of you guys started to subscribe. So if you did end up finding us through the short form content and you haven't checked out Becca already, she streams on Twitch a lot, and she also is an incredible editor. So make sure to check out her links down below, as I would really appreciate that as well. I also want to give a quick shout out to our channel members, being Zeke0 and Josh K Ultra Player, who support the channel monetarily. And if you guys are interested in becoming a member, just click the link down below for just a few dollars a month, and you get to support the channel with some nice perks. And obviously we have options like shouting out at the end of the video, as well as emotes for our streams. And there will be some more to come down the road. With that said though, I will see you guys in next week's video. Until then, peace out guys.